can ask questions.
Okay. Now it's my exam. I have to answer to professor, and so I hope to pass my exam on our constitutional reforms. Maybe you will be disappointed, I think, by my answers, because I'm a minister, and so some of answers are political answers, because you know we are not studying a model of reform, but we are trying to tell you and to explain you, to show you our reforms. But you know, when you have to pass a parliamentary approval, you need to find a balance between different interests in parliament and different interests between parliamentary groups. And so, for example, respect of the initial proposal by government, now we have made 140 amendments to the original texts, because we need at minimum 4 passages for different approval in Parliament. In this case, we will have at minimum 5 different approval before to hold the referendum. And so we need to find a balance in these points. And you can imagine it's more difficult to find the balance because senators have voted for their death, because they can be re-elected in the next Senate. And so it's not easy to convince 315 people to vote for their abolition, to cut their payment, and to think first of the future of their nation and our institutions than their personal interest on or political success. And so I think we have to be thankful to our senators for this choice, and to our MPs too, of course. But for us, I'm a member of the chamber, it's easier to vote for this test, for this content. And so I try to answer to all your questions, because there are very important and fundamental questions for our job. First of all, I think it's very important, the comparative instrument, and so it's very important, and it has been very important for our job to study different models, different European models mainly. But at the same time, we think that we have to find our solution for our country, because our history and our present, it's not the same of the German history or French history, for example. And so we have presented a reform by government very similar to German model. In our initial proposal, every region had the same number of representatives in Senate, and so every region had the same weight, I can say, in the Senate. But after the amendments and the debate in Parliament, now every region has a different weight independent of the number of their inhabitants. And so, for example, Lombardia, which is one of the most one of the regions with more inhabitants, have 16 senators, and there are some regions with just 2 senators. And this is the reason why it's difficult to have a very similar model to Germany. And at the same time, it's very difficult with this Senate and with these parties to find an agreement on the blocked vote for region as in Germany. Because I know it's not a good way to to write the constitutional reform, to think at the present situation, political present situation. But you can understand that in Senate, many MPs and many groups are working on our constitutional reforms, thinking of the present. And so at the moment, my party, the Democratic Party, lead the majority of regions, quite all the regions in Italy. And so the other party thinks that if every region has just one vote, one blocked vote, the new Senate will be just a PD Senate. And so it's difficult now to imagine the blocked vote for the future in our country. And so we think we can have different weight in different regions. Because it's also true that if you have more inhabitants, maybe you can have more weight because you represent more interest. And at the same time, I think the most similar model than our model is the Austrian model, more than France or German system. And instead of these, we have some differences also with the Austrian system, of course. But I think it's very important that in the new Senate, the members of Senate will be members of the regional councils of mayor. And I think it's important that they remain mayor and member of the regional councils. Because in our reforms, we are reforming, I said, also the division of powers, of legislative powers between regions and state. And you know that we are reducing the regional powers. We are strongly reducing the regional powers. And we are centralizing these competencies. And so you can obtain the support by regions, by the president of regions and inhabitants of the different regions, only if you can guarantee to them, to the members of the regional councils and mayors, that they will have a voice inside the Senate. Because in the Senate they can represent at national level the interest and the voices of their territories. And I think it's important they could have at the same time both roles. Because if they are just senator, they can't represent the territorial institutions. It's not a problem of residences or where you live, but of role, of what you are representing in that moment. And you can't represent only the national interests, but you have still to represent the local, the regional interest in the national legislative process. Even if Senate has just the advice powers for the majority of laws and not only the perfect equal power. Because I think that it's not only a problem of legislative powers, but also a problem of political weight. If the new Senate represents the territory and the regional councils, and I think that the president of regions will be members of the Senate, I think they will have a weight, a political weight, in the relationship between the chamber and between the government. And they can ask some modifications, some changes to law, and to have a weight in our choices. And so I think it's important that they could be at the same time representatives of regions and senators. And I can say, I think they can do at the same time both, because it's not necessary to stay in Senate for all the days in a week, because the new Senate will have less functions than today. And so they, for example, I imagine, can stay in Senate for a day in a week or a day in a month, for example, as in Germany. In Germany, the Senate, the higher chamber, works more or less once in a month. And so I imagine also for the Senate in Italy that they can work for 1 day a week or 2 days in a week. And it's not very different from today, because, for example, today in Italy we have a sort of, I don't know, a third chamber. This is the conference between state and regions. And it's a place in which the central government and the local government tries to find agreement about resources. And for that reason, the president of regions stay in Rome at minimum 1 day a week just now. And so in the future, maybe this conference will have less powers than today because they will be in the Senate. But it's not a problem for their activity in territories if they spend 1 day a week in Rome, because just now they do the same. And I think it's very important that our constitutional reform takes together both elements, the transformation of the legislative powers in the relationship between center and local government, and at the same time a new composition for Senate. We have discussed for some weeks the opportunity to take together these two elements in a unique project of reform. But I think it's the right choice, because you have to design a complex system with an harmony, a dialogue between the center and the territories. And I know it's hard maybe to understand or to know in France, where the state, the central power is very strong, because now you are discussing the opposite solution to reduce the state powers for the regions. But in our case, it's the opposite. Regions have a lot of powers now, and this is one of the reasons of our development, which is not so speed as in other countries, because you can imagine how can be difficult for an entrepreneur or an investor, Italian or foreign investor mainly, to understand why, if he decides to open a factory in a region, has to respect some environment limits, for example. And if after a month he decided to open another factory of the same companies in another regions, he has to understand and to know a different legislation on the environment limits.